Hey everybody, welcome back to our series on Hebrews 11. Today we're going to be looking at verse 4. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. So the first story from the Old Testament that the pastor decides to pull from is that of the story of Cain and Abel. And this is a story that's only a few verses long. It's found in Genesis 4, and we're going to be looking at it here in a second. But it's very compact story, but it is just overflowing with material to digest and to sit on and to meditate on. You know, this is a story that is, for as old as it is, theologians and philosophers and scholars still debate this story about why did God choose Abel's offering and not Cain's. You know, was there something wrong with it? And there's all this debate about, the sacrificial system that hasn't even been established yet and what have you. But I really think what the pastor states here in Hebrews 11 is my stance on it, and I would argue that we make the story a little bit more difficult than it needs to be. I would argue that the story in Genesis 4 tells you why God chose Abel's sacrifice over Cain's, and then the pastor just backs it up in Hebrews 11, almost on the opposite side of the Bible. So let's break down this verse little bit by little bit, and then as we do that, we'll also break down the Cain and Abel story found in Genesis 4. So by faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. So now we'll crack open the Bible to Genesis 4. We're going to start on verse 2. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. Now that's interesting just right out of the gate here, because Cain followed in his father's footsteps. When Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, they were given their punishments for disobeying God, and Adam's punishment was to basically work the ground until death, and to cultivate the land and what have you. And that's exactly what Cain did. He followed in his father's footsteps. He was a farmer, whereas Abel, he was a keeper of sheep, so he was a shepherd or what have you. And so that's interesting in and of itself, because Cain is the firstborn, and in ancient Near Eastern culture, firstborn were the heir to everything, so they were entitled to everything that the father had. You know, Cain following in his father's footsteps probably meant that he was going to take over the family business one day, and that just everything had been given to him as the firstborn, whereas Abel, not so much, and he had a life outside of what Cain did in terms of what was given to him and the affection that was poured on to him and how much effort the family probably put into him. So that's something that's really important just for context right there. Cain probably didn't have to work near as hard for the things that he had in life as Abel did. And in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of fruit of the ground. Now again, this is something I alluded to in the intro, but I'd like to stress again. This is only chapter 4 of Genesis. The sacrificial system given by Moses much later on has not been laid down. There is no, that we know of in terms in the biblical story, there is no, you sacrifice this, and this for this, and this sin or what have you. This is just something that they're doing. This is something that, as far as we know, every ancient culture worshipped a deity and sacrificed to that deity. So Cain brought the Lord offering of fruit, but Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and their fat portion. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So I believe right there is why God accepted Abel's sacrifice and not Cain's. And I think that's the point that the pastor is making in Hebrews 11. As I mentioned, since Cain was the firstborn and he was the heir to everything, Cain is the heir and Abel's the spare, as unfortunate as some people will look at those kinds of things. But Cain, again, probably did not have to work for much, whereas Abel did. Maybe Cain just thought he was entitled to God's acceptance and what have you, because it states that, yes, he did bring God a sacrifice, but it was just an offering of fruit from the ground, just something that he had grew. Whereas Abel brought firstborn of his flock. See, there's detail given there, and there are fat portions. And because of the way that the Bible was written and the materials that was available to them at the time when they were writing these documents, any detail is important. So I believe right there, the author of Genesis is telling you why God accepted Abel's offering and not Cain. Abel was putting his heart into it. Cain was probably just going through the motions. I'm entitled to everything when my dad passes away anyway. I'm following in his footsteps, yada, yada, yada. I guess I'm going to sacrifice. Whereas Abel put real heart and thought into what he was going to sacrifice the Lord. It was his firstborn, the firstborn of the flock, their fat portions. He put time and effort. His heart was in it. That's why God accepted Abel's offering and not Cain. And the author, the pastor from Genesis 11, he goes on. It was by that faith that he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. So let's go back to Genesis 4. We'll pick up on verse 6. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it." So God sees that Cain is downcast, which means Abel probably saw that his brother was upset too. In other words, Cain was not doing a very good job at hiding his frustration. But the Lord goes straight to Cain, and he's like, "Why are you angry? Why are you behaving like this? If you do well, you will be accepted." So he is commending Abel's sacrifice, and while acknowledging that he is not accepting Cain's. Abel has been putting all the right effort into it and his heart and what have you. And that's what God really desires. He desires your heart, whereas Cain is just bringing an offering. And he's like, listen, if you will just put your heart and soul into this effort, you will be accepted. But if you don't, now here's the warning, and this is actually really profound. This is why we should pay much more attention to this Cain and Abel story. He says, sin is crouching at your door. To crouch is like to hide yourself or to be hidden from something. It is hiding right there at your door. It's right there waiting to get you. As soon as you open the door to it, sin is going to come in and basically wreck your life. It's going to make you do something stupid. However, you can rule over it. And I think that's something that we as followers of Christ need to really understand, is that we have been slave to sin, and Jesus has freed us to that, but that still doesn't mean that sin is not crouching at our door, and its desire is contrary to ours. And we have the potential to rule over it. Jesus saved us from the slavery of sin, but that doesn't mean that we can go on and just sin willfully because the tab's been paid, as it were. Christ did not die on a cross so that you could go around acting like your own God. No. We need to take the Lord's words to Cain here and internalize them and put the cross in the center of that, and make sure we recognize, hey, we don't get to just do what we want, and that just because that our Savior has overcome sin and death doesn't mean that sin is not still waiting for us, and that we are not helpless in our fight against it either. So let's go on. In Hebrews 11, by faith Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. And we'll just finish up this short portion of the Cain and Abel story from Genesis 4. And Cain spoke to Abel, his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. So, like I said a little bit ago, Abel probably saw that Cain was upset, and it probably wasn't too hard for him to understand why Cain was upset. And yet, he still did what was right. He still brought God a proper offering. He still put time and effort, his heart and his soul, into bringing the Lord an offering, even though he knew it was making his brother upset. He still went into the field with his brother, even though he knew his brother was upset. And I am so thankful that the pastor made sure to include Abel in this hall of faith, because Abel sometimes gets the short end of the stick when we talk about this story. You know, Cain gets all the attention, but we shouldn't be figuring out where did Cain go wrong. We should try to be figuring out where did Abel go so right. And I believe it's just right there in the text. Abel put his heart, his soul, and his effort into his relationship with God in terms of bringing him a suitable sacrifice. And that's something that we should follow suit with. We should remember that Jesus paid the ultimate price for our sin. So again, that we're not slaves to it, and that we should honor him, and we should let those actions move us to the point that we act and live in faith to him, that we live for him with all of our heart and our soul and our mind, and we let him live through us, that we don't just go through the motions, that he is the front and center of our lives, and he will accept all that we have to offer him, even if it's just our heart. It's all that he wants. On this side of the cross, you know, our faith will speak for itself. You know, it says that by faith Abel still speaks even though he is dead, because his story has lived on. And that's something that we need to do better as brothers and sisters of the Lord, to remember that the best argument for our faith is just to let our faith speak for itself. And no matter what happens to us, whether we live or we die or what have you, that faith will live on. Okay? All right, guys, that's all I have for you today. Me and Jesus love y'all. May the Lord bless and keep you guys.